Thank you, Carol. So once again, my name is Shannon Stewart. I'm from the South Winnipeg area, and I'm a member of Churchill Park United Church. My main role at Messy Church is food planning, and as Carol said, I am a member of the conference planning team. Right now, I'd like to introduce Andrea Gallagher-Courteau. Andrea is an Anishinaabe citizen of Sagkeeng First Nation and a graduate of the University of Manitoba. She received her Bachelor of Arts Honours degree in Political Studies and a Bachelor's in Arts degree in Native Studies and a Master's of Arts degree in Political Studies, with a focus on Canadian and Indigenous policies. Andrea is passionate about Indigenous education, having spent time at the Treaty Relations Commissions of Canada, or is that Manitoba?
Manitoba.
The Manitoba Department of Education, and as a sessional instructor with both the University of Manitoba and the Canadian Mennonite University. Welcome, Andrea.
Hi, thank you. Great. So, hi, and welcome to Treaty 1 territory. That's where I'm currently residing. I reside in St. Anne, Manitoba, so just over half hour or so away from Winnipeg. But like Shannon said, my family comes from Sagkeeng First Nation is where my mom is from, and we still have family there. I never grew up there, but my mom was born there, and she went to residential school in Sagkeeng First Nation, and then after that was in the foster care system, so was part of what we refer to in Canada as the 60s scoop. So that was an event where a lot of Indigenous or First Nations kids were kind of scooped up by the government and placed in the foster care system. The government deemed that they didn't have proper guardianship and things like that. So there's been a lot of work to find some of these family members who've kind of been scattered a bit. So, and it's not just within places like here in Manitoba. Some of the kids from that time were scattered, and it didn't just happen during the 60s. It was for a longer period than that. But yeah, some of those kids were kind of scattered across Manitoba and even internationally. So we actually, even in my own family, have a cousin of my mom's that her and her sister went into the foster care system, and it took quite a while for my mom to find the records and make the inquiries. And one she found was in Pennsylvania, in the States, and the other sister, which we thought they would be together, the other one was in Quebec. So we've now found them, but for some that's been a whole process. So I guess for my immediate family, my mom was very lucky in that she stayed in Manitoba, still hours away, drive away from where she was born and raised. But yeah, I guess it kind of worked out. It worked out better than for a lot of other situations and other families. But yeah, it has caused disruption in Canada for Indigenous people. So I was going to talk a little bit about that, a little bit about some of our Indigenous history, storytelling, the influence of that, some of our cultural stories. So I will be touching on some cultural stories, histories, traditions. And if you have any questions, if anybody has any questions, feel free. I don't know how, I wasn't sure how interactive people would be, but I am completely, open to having discussions about anything really that anyone is curious about. So I believe I have just for some visuals, I also have a little PowerPoint to kind of help with some of the storytelling. Yeah, so Turtle Island Teachings is kind of what I'm calling like what I'm going to be talking about today. And for those of you who may not know, here in Canada, we often refer to, Indigenous people often refer to North America as being Turtle Island. So there's a whole story I'll get to about why we call it Turtle Island. We have our own story about that. So the next, there. So this is just a picture of me. I was just going to start with why I like to do this, to come talk to people and share just a little bit about me. So the one holding the feather fan and looking like I'm scowling a little bit. I swear the sun was just in my eyes. That's me there in the pink. I was a jingle dress dancer when I was small. And I did that basically until I outgrew my dress. My mom had made my dress for me. So I forget how many jingles are attached to it, but she sewed all of them on, and I had, we refer to as regalia. I had a whole set of regalia to go to powwows and other functions. We have some celebrations here other than powwows. There's things like, we call it folklorama here in Winnipeg, where we celebrate all sorts of different cultures in, that make Winnipeg our home. Just celebrating that whole ethnic diversity that we have here. So we have a celebration. It's a bunch of different concurrent celebrations in folklorama. So one of the celebrations is for the First Nations people. So, and that's my brother. He was a grass dancer, and he actually had another one. So he did a little bit longer than I did. I really do hope to make another one, but it is time consuming to make a jingle dress. We got so far as plans, and my mom and I were picking out like colors and fabric, and then the pandemic kind of happened, and everything just came to a bit of a standstill when it came to that. And we got busy with, work, and everything gets a little more complicated during a pandemic, turns out. And I have a 2-year-old. So the picture next to it is me now. This was taken just, I think, last month. And that's my son, Theo, who is currently in the basement. So it's with his father. So at some point, if you hear some yelling, I apologize. We're trying to keep him occupied with Lego right now. So yeah, and that's another reason why I like to talk about this kind of stuff. When I was growing up, all of this, in Indigenous culture, the history of what happened here in Canada, just there were a lot of negative connotations surrounding not only Indigenous culture, but just being, a First Nations person. So it wasn't always something that we talked about. And, growing up for me, there was a lot of our history was missing. Like, we weren't very represented, and it was better for me than it would have been obviously for my mom living through it. But strange things like, in something that to now we all kind of know in Canada what residential schools were. These were schools that children were taken from their family. They were brought to these schools. Some of them were day schools. They were just there during the day. But some of them you lived there most of the year, and you didn't see your family. And that was the case for my mother. So she was taken when she was 5, and she and her older brother, he's a few years older than her, were taken from their family on the reserve and from my kukum, my grandmother. And they had to live there. They were separated because boys and girls lived in their own dormitories or whatever, and weren't supposed to interact. And things like they weren't allowed to speak their language anymore. My mom's first language is Ojibwe or Anishinaabe, and she wasn't permitted to do that. There's a lot of cultural traditions they were no longer allowed to do. They weren't allowed to pray in their own way anymore. And the residential school that she went to was run by the Catholic Church. It was there were some that are run by a Catholic Church. Most of them were run by Catholic Church. Some were Anglican. I believe there may have been a few that were that had some involvement with United, but it was primarily the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church that ran residential schools in Canada. But yeah, and I mean there were repercussions for not doing what you were supposed to in those schools, and there's a whole history of physical and emotional and sexual abuse that happened in those schools. So that was something that I knew growing up anyway, and it was just strange to me when I graduated high school, and one of my close friends, we were just driving around, and she just all of a sudden asked me, like, so what were residential schools? Do you know anything about that? And I'm like, we went to school and we graduated now. And she was just asking because she knew I was First Nations. And I was just like, yeah, I guess we really didn't talk about it. So there's so many people that just didn't know that these existed. Why, like, what had happened to the Indigenous people? And it's hard to understand the perspective of your neighbor, people you live with in the same community, if you don't understand the history of what happened to them by virtue of being who they are. So that's why today it's just so important, and so much work has been done, and I really embrace any opportunity I have to discuss these issues, to discuss the ways in which living in Canada has been different for Indigenous, particularly First Nations people. And I want, my son is going to be aware of our culture. He already, my mom, which is his kukum, that's our word. And, she teaches him how to drum, she's engaging with that with him. And trying to teach him some words and things in ways that, so that he can embrace it too, because he will be considered a First Nations person as well. So, so I think the next slide was just in case anybody is not really familiar with some of the terminology, because we hear a lot of words, and I know that it can be confusing. Having taught it, I know that it can be very confusing, because you're like, well, what do I say? Like, what do I call people? And that's always my fear too. I like to talk to people because I never want anybody to be too afraid to engage with Indigenous people or with the subject matter, right? So if anybody does have any questions, in terms of like the terminology, there's the word Indian that you may be aware of. That's not really something that gets used very often anymore. Sometimes, Indigenous people will sometimes refer to themselves as Indians, or, your people that but it's something that like just generally other people don't use. It's usually considered somewhat inappropriate. We don't refer to, we don't think of ourselves as Indian, and also it's confusing. It's a term that was given to us because they thought that they had arrived in India and we were Indians, and clearly someone made a mistake there. So we but unfortunately it was a name that's stuck around, and they still use it in the United States to a certain degree, American Indians. And they do have like the National Indian Brotherhood and things like that, but it is slowly changing. It is phasing out completely, I think. So maybe eventually we will refer to people from India solely as Indians, and we'll no longer refer to ourselves as that. But there are things like, technically, according to the government, that is still the term for us as a group of people in Canada, because of the Indian Act, which is a whole other thing. But that's why another reason why you may hear the word. Native was another word that was often used to describe First Nations or Indigenous people in general. Again, it is more so now considered a bit derogatory. But I know, when I was younger, it was pretty common. But yeah, it's more so, there's been a lot of negative connotation associated with it. So that one is also something that's kind of phased out. Aboriginal, for most of my growing up, was the word to use to describe all people, whether that's, First Nations, Métis, or whatever. It was Aboriginal people, and to an extent that's still somewhat used. But again, there was some debate over whether that was an appropriate term to be using. Some people see Aboriginal, the ab, as like abnormal, is not of origin. So there was some discussion about that, and I know that there are some people who don't like the term, but there are still people like me. I don't really have any particular problem with it. But what we do hear most commonly now is what I usually use, which is Indigenous people. So that's just the people who were Indigenous to this land, and that usually is referring to First Nations people, Métis people, and Inuit peoples. So those are the three groups that kind of make up, in Canada anyway, the term Indigenous. The term Indigenous also links us globally through the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So there's Indigenous people of the United States, of South America, of Australia. They're all referred to as Indigenous people. There's Scandinavian Indigenous people, the Sami people. So it sort of created this community worldwide of similar people who have these similarities of being Indigenous and being, in some ways have found a history of oppression in their native lands. So yeah, and in Canada, First Nations is, the original people. First Nations usually is tied to a reserve. You are registered as a First Nations person with the government. So if you hear of a reserve community, then usually those people that are part of that community are First Nations. But there's different histories between the First Nations, the Inuit people, which are the people of the northern communities, like far north in Canada, and Métis people, who have a history of coming from both First Nations culture and the settler cultures, and it kind of created its own culture here in Canada. So whether that was, you know, the mixing of First Nations people with British, French, also often Scottish people who came to settle in North America, and they've kind of have their own history and their own rights, and it's a whole other story for them, their own languages even. So that's just a bit about the terminology. Just I like to try clarify anything about that. So getting to the rest of it next, just briefly about me. So within that category of being First Nations, there's your own ethnic group of First Nations, I suppose. And so for myself, I am an Ojibwe person. In our own language, though, we're referred to as the Anishinaabe. And the Anishinaabe people can be found in Canada in that area there that is designated like kind of pink. So it goes across the lower area of the prairies, down into Ontario. Yeah, I don't know if they're there. Yeah, that's great. Covering Ottawa, Toronto, that whole area, coming up close to like Montreal. That's where you would start to find like the Iroquois people, and yeah, into the United States. I mean, we were here before boundaries existed. So there are plenty of people in the United States who are relatives, who are Anishinaabe people. Sometimes they are referred to as Saulteaux people. And that also is another word that you might find in Ontario is Saulteaux. But it's all a name for the same people. There are about 200 communities in Canada that are Ojibwe or Anishinaabe. And you can see I don't know if you want to keep the slide up a bit, it might be easier to just see. Yeah, all these red communities in the bottom of what is Manitoba, those are all Anishinaabe communities. So all the southern here so it's mostly all of them in the south, with the exception of about 5 blue dots here, which are Dakota communities. So these communities are referred to as bands, or sometimes you might hear the word tribe. That's also not really used, but it's a lot of communities, and really one culture, and they all use the same language, which is Anishinaabe Moin, and Anishinaabe in Anishinaabe Moin just means the original people. That's our own word for it. And so you'll hear different dialects. So I mean, it's similar to other languages, right? There's different dialects. There's slightly different writing of words. Some only have one A after the N there for Anishinaabe. Some just it's Anishinaabe, starts with an N. So stuff like that. It's very similar. Sorry, that's supposed to say spirituality. Traditional spirituality was kind of our people's way of life, rather than we didn't have like an organized religion. But this spirituality kind of persisted through culture, traditions, stories, and some ceremonies, right? So the next. And so, I mean, because we're a people that don't really, there's not a history of it's not like settler communities and other countries that favor written language. We don't really have books from prior to settlement or anything like that. That the way that First Nations cultures told their history was through oral history, was through the emphasis on storytelling. So this remains kind of a really important part of our culture, and these stories that that persist. Now a lot of them are written out. So like the story that I'm going to tell is something that we do have books on them now, and it's great. Like my son, my 2-year-old, has some books that are about Anishinaabe culture. He also has a handful of books that try to teach him the language too. So it's really great to have those now. But you know, we've had to adapt to writing down our stories. What our culture looked like at one time is very different than what we have now. I mean, it's just a reality of colonialism and how everything has kind of happened in Canada. So there was this importance of community. And I mean, there still is. It's still very, very important. And it's important for people to realize that Indigenous families, First Nations families, they operate a bit differently. Growing up, I recognized that, you know, my mom's family was different than my dad's family, not only in the way that it was structured, but the closeness, the connectivity, and kind of leaning on one another for different things was just different than, like, my dad is English, Irish background, Canadian. And yeah, so the storytelling is something that happens in your own family. I think that happens worldwide too. Like there's obviously this emphasis on the written word, but I think on a much smaller scale, every family does this. Storytelling is important to your family's history. Most families don't have someone writing down everything that happens in your family. The most usually you have is some like genealogy book. I know my husband's family, the older French families in Canada often have some sort of book about who's related to who and all of that. But I don't think a lot of families necessarily have that. So it's about sharing stories. And that was important not only for your own family, but in the case of Indigenous people, for the culture, for teaching the younger generations. And so because we had this importance, there is a big impact by what happened, what I was talking about earlier with residential schools and with families being separated and, you know, foster care system and all of those things had a really severe impact on how these stories were being shared on. So there was just this disruption, and we've lost so much. Every time we lose an elder in our communities, you know, we tend to say that it's like a library has been lost, just because of the knowledge that they keep, the knowledge that they pass down in their communities, being part of their communities. So storytelling is really at the heart of our culture. So, and we do that, like the picture here, I don't know if anybody is familiar with it, if you're from Manitoba, that picture is of Bannock Point. It is someplace in the Whiteshell. It is considered like a sacred place. But other people, like any Manitoban is welcome to visit it. And so that's the petriforms. It's rocks that have been placed in, you know, different shapes for the purpose of teaching, and they've been there for ages and ages. So it's still often used for ceremony, for people to coming to visit, to use the petriforms for this storytelling or ceremonial purposes. So the next slide. So like most cultures, we have a creation story. So and it's funny because there are similarities between other First Nations cultures and their creation stories. And also there's some very stark similarities with the creation stories or other religious stories in, other countries across the world. So there's this idea of, the Great Flood. I think we're all familiar with some very famous stories about a Great Flood. So it was really not that different. Our own culture had its own story about what happened during this Great Flood. So while we didn't have, Noah or an ark, for the Anishinaabe people, we had Nanabusho. And here there was a very similar story for the Iroquois people. You can see the image here. They referred to her as Sky Woman, and there's these differences, and there will be slight differences even in Anishinaabe culture. Like there's slightly different interpretations. So I always tell people when working with Indigenous communities, like, you don't get too hung up on the spelling of this or like the exact translation of this, because that wasn't like what we focus on. And different dialects, you're going to get slightly different like rules around different things. It's important to recognize what that person telling you, what's their truth. So there are a lot of parallels between different cultures. And so we have a creation story. The Iroquois, the Sky woman, was a pregnant woman who fell from the sky and landed in water. And then from there are a lot of similarities to our story. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our story, which is about Nanabusho. So the next. Sorry, so the next slide. Right. So Nanabusho, and you'll find, again, the spelling of his name different. Some it's just Nanabush. So he was, in our culture, a man that was half man. His mother was an original person, Indigenous person, and his father was a spirit, often referred to as the west, like the west wind, or like a western spirit. So before the Great Flood, and this differs too, sometimes there's, there was nothing, but in some other iterations of the story, there were people that were, brought here by the Creator to Earth. The Creator created like the original people, and again, very similar to other stories, these people grew to, prideful, and they grew greedy, and they began to fight with one another, and all of this was building and displeasing the Creator, which in my language we refer to as Kichimanito. So the Creator then decided to cause a flood in, that purifying kind of fashion. And our culture says that it was Nanabusho who, survived this flood. He did so by, I think he climbed atop, some debris in some cases. In another version of the story, I believe he had the foresight to create a raft out of, some of the logs. And in any case, he is somebody who is, from this story and others, seen as a creator, a protector, but also in other stories, he's kind of referred to as a trickster. And in other stories, like you'll see up here in the corner, this green picture, he's the birth of Nanabusho, he's a shapeshifter in that story. He sometimes turns into animals in some stories. And really what I like to consider him is a teacher, is that he is a figure that, you know, teaches us a lot of these lessons in how to kind of live our best life. Yeah, so you can find all sorts of books, whether online or in person, about Nanabusho and some of these stories that he's or these teachings that he's imparted on the Anishinaabe people. So, so in the story, Nanabusho, then there was the flood and he was on his own. But I mean, there obviously were animals who could survive this flood, animals that either were birds that were able to, you know, fly and then just float around in the water. And then there's all sorts of, like, obviously the fish, and then from that it's going to be important, the turtle, and also some of the animals who also live in water. And so if we go to the next slide, we discuss some of these animals who helped Nanabusho. So he asked these animals to help him in this task, and he wanted to recreate the world, essentially. So what he needed to do that, you couldn't create something from nothing. He's, you know, in a way, because he's part spirit, you could see him as more of a demigod kind of figure, but he doesn't create out of nothing. He isn't the creator. So Nanabusho needed some soil. He needed that to begin to recreate. So he asked the animals, is there any amongst you who could dive down as deep, because it was, you know, a great flood, but he knew that deep down, one of them might be able to reach the soil. So first, there was the loon, who is very good at diving, for birds especially, and the loon, you know, agreed to dive down and see if it could reach the soil. And the loon came back up and just, you know, out of breath, and no, you know, sorry, Nanabusho, I couldn't reach the earth. So then next was the beaver. And then the beaver said, well, I can do it, I'll go down. So then the beaver dove as far down as he could and didn't quite reach, came back up, same as the loon, you know, tired, and said, I tried my best, I couldn't reach the bottom of the water to get the soil for you. And then next, obviously very, very good in water, the otter decided, okay, I'm very good at diving, I'm gonna go down, Nanabusho, don't worry. So the otter dove down and was gone a while, but then came back up and said, I'm sorry, Nanabusho, I couldn't reach the soil, I don't have anything for you. And then amongst the animals, the muskrat said that, okay, Nanabusho, I'm gonna try, I'm gonna go down and I'm going to get the soil for you to recreate the world. And the other animals just sort of started laughing, because the muskrat's much smaller than, you know, the beaver, and smaller even than the otter. And they laughed. They said, muskrat, you're much too small. You're not going to be able to reach the bottom. If we can't do it, then you can't do it. And the muskrat, determined, dove down, and they waited. And the muskrat, they waited and waited, and he was gone for quite a while. And then the muskrat finally appeared. He just floated up with the bubbles, and Nanabusho grabbed him and he wasn't saying anything. He seemed unconscious, and then they realized he had been down there too long. The poor muskrat, he didn't have enough air, and the muskrat had passed away. But then they noticed in the muskrat's hand that he had this little bit of earth in his hand. And it wasn't much, but, well, I guess his paw. The muskrat had just enough for Nanabusho to start turning the earth and working it so that he could recreate their land, their home. So everyone, again, it taught the lesson, not to discount someone because, they're smaller or you don't think that they can do it. And everyone had to, acknowledge and thank the muskrat for his sacrifice. So in the end, they did have the dirt to create this new land. So here's just some images of different Indigenous artists that they're part of depicting this story. This last one here of the muskrat coming up, and you can see he's got in his hand a ball of dirt, and the fish kind of following him upwards. He's supposed to be coming to the surface. So if we go to the next slide, this is how it becomes Turtle Island. So recognizing that the muskrat did so much, that you need somewhere to place this earth to make our new land. So the turtle, who had been part of the party, had said, the muskrat gave his life, the very least I can do is carry this new land. So he spread it on Turtle's back, and they just grew and grew. And so you see in this picture, North America, we say, is living on Turtle's back in this story. So everything has grown from that turtle, and the turtle continues to carry us. And the turtle is, a teacher. The turtle is it's a very important figure in our culture, is that turtle, because it continues to give us life, to give us this land. And there's other ways in which the turtle has become very important part of our culture, and is a teaching tool too. So the one on the right there, you see that the turtle has, and this is true of turtles, I think almost all turtles I've seen, like turtles, like sea turtles and all different kinds of turtles, have 13 of these patterns on their back. And in our culture, we often use that to be another way that we show, like we're on Turtle Island, is there are 13 moons, sometimes 12, sometimes 13, but there can be up to 13 moons in a year. So each one of these spaces, and there's these little patterns kind of around it, and it's 28, so there's 28 days in the cycle of one of these moons. So we also have stories, about that, about the different moons. And I don't think our culture is the only one that has different names for the moon. I think right now we're in a moon, it's a harvest moon right now. But there's different names. This one, I think it's currently like the falling leaves or something, like it's all to do with fall right now in the moon cycle. But there's different stories about all these different moons, and that again can be linked back to the turtle. And I remember when I first learned this, and I swear I looked at a bunch of turtles. I started Googling turtles just to check, and I was like, by damn, like they all do have these 13 like sections on their back. So it's kind of crazy how there's so much truth in in some of these stories. So yeah, the turtle continues to be a teacher. So the next one here, the turtle is also part of our 7 sacred teachings. So we have creation stories. We have, it's all more so teachings when it comes to Indigenous culture and our spirituality. They all talk about the creator, about Kichimanito, and things that have been imparted to us from the creator. And some of that is these 7 sacred teachings and how to use these to live life as best as you can. And so the buffalo, the bear, the wolf, the beaver, the turtle, the eagle, and Sabe are the holders of these 7 sacred teachings. They represent these different teachings. For those of you who don't know, Sabe is actually the Indigenous or the Anishinaabe word for Bigfoot, essentially, for Sasquatch. So it's probably something that you just think, oh, well, we've taken these pictures and because I think a lot of people have seen those pictures of Bigfoot that are always blurry and you're always just like, is that, or is that like a hunter or something weird? Like, is that a weird bear standing up? But we had, long before these blurry photos, we had our own stories about Sabe and about how he lived on his own in the woods and wasn't a malevolent person or figure in any way. There's a lot of other stories with a lot of other I guess creatures or whatnot, but Sabe was always a good thing. Kind of lived on his own. He lived his own life honestly. So if we go to the next slide, I'll just say quickly a little bit about these 7 sacred teachings for those who may not be aware. So the 7 sacred teachings, and this is something that now I'm just always so blown away that this is something that a lot of kids now even learn about in school, are these 7 sacred teachings. It's so instrumental to Indigenous culture, especially in Manitoba. So we get the teaching of love, and this is a gift from the eagle. So the eagle and the teaching of love, this is symbolic of fire and the creator. Love is the most important thing to hold in your heart. So this is one of the most important teachings. The reason why the eagle is representative of love is that the eagle is able to fly high up into the sky, one of the highest, and therefore has that closeness to what we consider the creator. Respect is the gift from the buffalo. Respect for oneself, and you have respect for oneself, respect will also be bestowed. So it is to teach people to be kind to one another, to respect one another, and to think about others, kind of the opposite of selfishness. Another teaching is through the bear. The bear carries courage. We seek the strength and courage to face our greatest fears. And we must face our challenges. It's just, having that bravery, that courage to do sometimes what is hard. Like I said, honesty is the teaching that is carried by Sabe or Sasquatch. And this the honesty isn't to be confused with truth. Those are 2 different things. Honesty is also to be honest with yourself in who you are, being true to yourself and finding peace, with yourself and that truth. There's the beaver, which carries wisdom. So again, wisdom not to be confused with knowledge. You hold knowledge, you gain wisdom, right? So wisdom is gained through experience, and knowledge is, you know, something that you can receive, like you can read, you know, it's not necessarily the same. And so you accept responsibility and accountability. And there's the wolf, which carries humility. Central to like a wolf's life is the idea of a pack. Most wolves have packs. And part of being part of a community is, you know, having that humility. Being part of that community means that you have to have your own place, understanding that it's not about the individual, it's about the whole. So to ensure survival, the pack must be as one. You have to work together. And, you know, to not to be boastful and have just this idea of like me, right? To work together for the common good. And having that humility allows us to ask for guidance and to ask for it humbly from others or the creator. And then also back to the turtle. The turtle carries truth. This truth is symbolic of law and principle. The turtle doesn't change. We're all on turtle's back. The turtle has been chosen to be this bearer of truth and the basic truth and laws of nature. Okay, so next one. And then the turtle finds itself in our clan system as well. So there's the clans are how we structure society, or traditionally how we have structured society. They're called dodem in my language. So an Anishinaabe dodem. So myself, my family, my mom is a member of the Bear clan. So we would say Makwa dodem. So this is just the ones here that I'm talking about these are the 7 original clans. But there are more clans today than these original 7. So if somebody says that they're from a clan that, you know, isn't part of the 7, like there's more clans today. People have kind of it's evolved. But these original 7 had their original like kind of roles in society, and this is mirrored in some other ways in our society through there's things which there's a society sort of called the Midewin, and it's a Midewin, we have lodges, and that's more of like for purposes of healing and spirituality, like that's kind of a whole thing unto itself. And there's prayer and all that, but all the different clans have their own role within the Midewin society in Anishinaabe culture. So each of these roles for each of these clans also go back to the 7 teachings as well. So we have Makwa, which is the bear in our language, Wabashkeshe, that's the martin, the gigo, that's the fish. It's also sometimes like the turtle clan. It's also within that same designation. Mang for the loon, Beneshe for the crane, for the bird. Sorry, that's the eagle or other birds sometimes. Ajak for the crane, and Wabashkeshe for the deer. So each of these have their own history, but maybe just quickly I'll mention what each of them, how they relate. So traditionally the loon and the crane within this clan system work together as like eloquent leaders and orators. So you see in the image shows the loon is like chieftainship, and also the crane there for this chief kind of role, so being leaders in your community. The Martin clan, these are skilled warriors, peacekeepers. They're responsible for maintaining the warrior society. The Deer clan are gentle, kind, artistic members of society traditionally. Also, there's the members of the Fish clan, also the Turtle, which are responsible for water ceremonies and also, for obvious reasons, and the community intellectuals, they're the teachers. And that relates to the role of the turtle in truth. So we often, refer to the turtles as the teachers in our communities. The bear is for the protectors of the community. They're responsible for safeguarding the community. And also, because I spend so much time patrolling, what does a bear do? It also digs on bark and berries and bushes and things. So they're usually also knowledge keepers when it comes to wild medicines, herbs, and things like that. And then the bird clans are spiritual advisors, teachers. And like I said, because bird clans, whether it's the eagle or thunderbird, they get, highest in the sky. They go as close to the creator as possible. And then just really quick, if I can, the last thing I just wanted to kind of touch on to talk about this holistic kind of worldview in our society for Anishinaabe teachings. We use all of this for teachings. It's all about storytelling. It's all about teaching. And the next slide shows that there's the medicine wheel is something that often comes up in Indigenous culture, not just for Anishinaabe people, but I know Cree people. And just, it's kind of one of those things, kind of like a dream catcher, which we also have a story about, the dream catcher. But this is something that has just kind of been perpetuated in kind of this larger conversation of Indigenous cultural traditions. So this medicine wheel, we talk about the circle, like how very important is this idea of the circle. And there's the north, the east, the west, the south. So there's these different aspects to your life, the spiritual, the physical, the mental, the emotional, they're all important. They all work together. Winter, summer, spring, fall. And the same thing with like wind, earth, fire, water, they all kind of like have their place in the seasons in the year. Like it all kind of links together and it's all part of the self. You need all of these things to work in harmony. And we have in our culture 4 sacred medicines. And you can see next to it here. And that's, in the north, the sage, which is actually in this picture on the left, it's actually in the black one here, that's the sage. And then there's in the spring, there's the tobacco. The tobacco was the first one. So all of this, everything starts in the east. The sun comes up in the east here in North America and it sets, in the west. And that's where, when you see a teepee, if you see a traditional teepee, if you see a sweat lodge, any of these things, any of these ceremonies, we have our doors facing east. It's one of those things that you don't know, you won't notice until like it's mentioned to you, I think. Like for me too, it was like, oh yeah, I guess so. And you go in the east, you go through inside clockwise because you're going through life clockwise, the same thing with our teachings, and come back. So the east is the beginning of things, the spring. And the first thing to be given to us was the tobacco from the creator. And then there's sweetgrass. And then, yeah, the cedar, which is at the top here. Cedar is, something we use for protection. For all of these are for purification. We use them for prayers, for smudging, for purifying spaces and thoughts and things. And the cedar is often protection as well. I know people who hang it in their house, who you know, and maybe in their car or whatever, if you think that you need the protection. So yeah, so those are just some of the things that I thought would be interesting.